Welcome to the Modern Intimacy Podcast, a show about mental health, sex, relationships, education and tips, and those private things we need to talk about more publicly without restrictions. I'm your host, Dr. Kate Balestrieri. A licensed psychologist, certified sex therapist, packed couples therapist, and sex addiction therapist, I know that mental health is directly tied to the quality of our relationships and our sex lives. I'm passionate in my desire to smash stigmas and shine a light on societal issues that may be negatively affecting our lives, relationships, and sexuality. During this podcast, I will also give you practical answers and insights to questions you've been wondering about. We should all have fulfilled, happy lives, and we get there by erasing shame, consciously digging deeper, building healthy connections, and by getting curious together. Thanks for joining me. Let's get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Modern Intimacy Podcast. Today on this episode, we're going to talk about the Madonna Whore Complex. And many of you may have heard about this. We're going to take it a little bit deeper because the Madonna Whore Complex is not just something that is experienced by some men. It's kind of a collective way of categorizing people's worth. So I'm really excited today to talk with Brooke Brownlee, one of our clinical associates at Modern Intimacy. And Brooke wrote an amazing blog on the Madonna Whore Complex. And yeah, let's get into it. So Brooke, tell me a little bit about kind of what prompted you to write this blog and how you first learned about the Madonna Whore Complex.
Yeah, that's a good question. I wrote this blog. It kind of started during the Roe v. Wade overturn and kind of thinking about society's view on women and who's kind of worthy of this good health care and for what reason. So I was seeing like this dichotomy of women who are more sexually expressive, who maybe don't want to be mothers, sort of taking away their rights and their freedoms and putting them into this category that is inherently bad. They don't deserve this healthcare. And that kind of sparked, writing this blog, but it also kind of came from a place of working with women who were stuck in this dichotomy or were in a relationship with a man who no longer sexually desired them and kind of that pain around that. And I realized that there wasn't a lot of language and kind of labeling of the Madonna Whore Complex, kind of putting words and doing some education around that was really helpful for a lot of people.
Absolutely. I think it's really underestimated and underdiscussed just how frequently the Madonna Whore Complex can manifest within people's mindsets about women. And then, of course, how that affects them internally, how their own identity for men and women, and also how it affects relationships, society, and to your point, your astute point, legislation.
Right.
Yeah. Well, let's define the Madonna Whore Complex. Can you tell our listeners sort of what it is and how it came to be coined?
Yeah. So it came from Freud, I think back in like the early 1900s, where he was seeing kind of this phenomenon with men, usually cisgender and heterosexual relationships, that they had all these romantic feelings and they loved their partner, but they no longer sexually desired them. So basically, women could not be viewed as loving and both sexual at the same time. And it was kind of Freud's theory that men with Madonna Whore Complex, they got their romantic feelings for their partner confused with their feelings for their mother. Therefore, they couldn't view their partner as sexual anymore. And so that's changed. Feminist researchers have kind of expanded this theory out into society, but it's basically categorizing women into two kind of rigid dichotomies of a woman who's, loving and has a lot of motherly qualities and seen as pure and someone to protect, versus somebody who is more sexually assertive and seen as more promiscuous, who someone with Madonna Whore Complex might sexually desire, but has to degrade them in the process to be fully aroused.
Yeah, thank you. That was such a great articulation of this complex. And I think we can look at it as one that really is in place to uphold structures of power, because both of these dichotomous categories that women are subjected to are categories that define how a woman should be and how they should be in service of men. Right? So women who are placed into this Madonna conceptualization or Madonna category, to just as you said, are seen as motherly, nurturing, but they're also seen as good girls, right? And these are girls that uphold the scripts that have been given to them, and they don't deviate, they don't make waves, they don't get bigger than what they're supposed to be. And I don't necessarily mean body size, I mean in the way that they take up space in the world. And use their voice and declare a relationship with power for themselves, or rather don't, right? They are the women who are happy to be in service of others, and therefore they are rewarded with protection, in air quotes, and some sort of idealization, according to the patriarchy script about women who behave.
Yeah, it's a harmful category either way. This being a Madonna or being considered, a whore or someone needed to be sexually degraded, it's harmful for both women in both categories. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about the whore category. So who are the women who would get categorized in that grouping?
Yeah, somebody who's more sexually assertive, maybe somebody who even has boundaries around sex, somebody who's maybe not relationship focused, can be put in these sort of horror categories of challenging the man or challenging his ego.
Yeah, I would say anyone who dares to assert a relationship with her own body that's hers. Often women who make body modifications are placed into that category. Women who initiate divorce or who are victims of divorce or who are left by their partners and fall into the single mother category. Really, anyone who doesn't uphold this patriarchal ideal of what a woman, quote unquote, should be or do. And so it's not that the women in the whore category are liberated from expectations of how to be human givers, to use the language of Emily Nagoski and Kate Mann, but those women are seen as giving of other things, giving of the space to be destructive, giving of the space to be sexual. When they don't follow the expectations of how they should be in service in the whore category, they are subjugated even more and seen as people who don't have to be respected or regarded at all.
Right. And it's, single mothers especially can be really harmed by this.
Absolutely. So let's talk about the misogyny that's so inherent in this Madonna Whore complex. What's your take?
Yeah, I mean, it's this upholding these patriarchy standards and, that fear of being more sexually assertive is you will no longer be seen as a fit long-term romantic partner. You're sort of categorized. And so, that upholds these, I kind of see like these dating TikToks or people giving these dating advice of, don't sleep with a man till the third date, or, all these weird rules that we place on women so to be seen as this fit partner, someone who can fit this mold, created by misogynistic men.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that there's a lot of subjectivity in some cases, but also not, right? And I think the level of subjectivity really depends on how much misogyny and sexism a man aligns with and how he sees women. So, he may be more comfortable with a woman who's divorced and not see her as someone who is a person he can devalue if, for example, he respects divorce as a process. What often dictates the degree of idealization or devaluation in these categories, respectively, the idealization into the Madonna category and devaluation into the whore category, really is related to the degrees of sexism that a man aligns with in his ideology. And most of the time, this is very unconscious. So a lot of men don't know what their ideology even really is consciously about women, but they've been given so many messages and they become internalized as truths. And so I think what we're seeing is men with higher levels of ambivalent sexism have a higher rate of bifurcating women into one of these two camps. So what is ambivalent sexism? It's sexism that has a higher acuity or a higher degree, rather, of benevolent sexism or hostile sexism. And that framework really aligns with the Madonna Whore Complex, if you think about it.
If you can't define it and you're kind of stuck in the middle and you don't know how you feel about women, it can kind of create these parallels.
Yeah, or if you've been conditioned to believe that women are good if, or women are bad if. And I think as a culture, we often fall into the trap of this dichotomous thinking when it comes to people's worth. And of course, sex has been a platform upon which people have, decided other people's worthiness erroneously. So it makes a lot of sense to me that the Madonna Whore Complex would be this manifestation of worthiness, actually, that gets unfortunately tethered to people's perceptions of women's relationship with sex. So I wonder, what are your thoughts on how the Madonna Whore Complex maintains the patriarchal belief systems?
Yeah, it's meant to hold kind of men in this position of power, and there's a lot of feminist research and just kind of research sociologists have done looking deeper into this. There's William Simon and John Gayon. Sorry, my French, I didn't pronounce that last name correctly, but they kind of have this, they dove into it really deeply of looking at sex, not just from a biological standpoint of how our society impacts the way we view sex in sexual conduct. And they kind of came up with this, we have these sexual scripts, which are passed down through the generations. And women are seen as the gatekeepers of sex. They prefer relational sex, where men prefer more casual sex, and how that has been passed down through the generations and has really impacted, people's view of sex.
You're saying that women biologically prefer relational sex, or those are the social scripts that have been handed down?
Those are the social scripts that have been handed down.
Yeah, can we say that one more time for the cheap seats in the back, right? Because women are capable of enjoying casual sex and men are capable of enjoying relational sex, but often both genders are conditioned to only experience sex because it's tethered to their identity in these very limited ways.
Exactly. And it's just been continually passing down through the generations, starting, way back from purity culture and Christianity, and just continuing through till now.
Yeah. How do we see that showing up in modern day language?
I hear it. I think the thing that I keep hearing is this define feminine or
divine feminine.
Yeah, divine feminine, or taking a woman out of her quote unquote masculine era and into her feminine era. It's a rebranding of misogyny, really.
It really is. It's a rebranding of benevolent sexism, right? Because I, as a man, have the power to make her soft and submissive, right? Which is exactly repurposed misogynistic language that conditions women to be helpless and vulnerable, while men are touted to be these strong caretakers, who wield a lot of power, even if that power is benevolent, right? Exactly. And it distances men from being in touch with their vulnerable sides. I love that you highlighted that language. I hear it a lot too when we talk about, or when we hear folks on the interwebs talking about high value and low value people
Yes.
in the dating world.
Yes.
Yeah. That to me is absolutely rebranded Madonna Whore Complex, because one of the things that I think the Madonna Whore Complex really does psychologically for men, in addition to upholding patriarchal power structures, it serves as a way for them to define their own worthiness. So, because sex is so shamed in our culture, but men are also conditioned to want it all the time, and to try to get it all the time, and to cultivate sexual opportunities all the time, there sometimes can be inherent shame in a lot of men about their own relationship with sex and their own worthiness around it. And so, what I see when I'm working with men is they sometimes will unconsciously have this Madonna Whore complex set up in their mind. And the ways that they interact with women and the women with whom they interact in both these categories give them some sort of access to seeing themselves a certain way. So if they're with someone they determine is a whore, or who is unrespectable, or who is someone they don't have to care about, if we use that language, they can see themselves as powerful, competent, virile, dominant, and without any emotional attachment. And that really supports a lot of hegemonic or precarious masculinity around being somebody who is stoic and not really emotionally bothered by things. Also, when they partner up with somebody who they then desexualize, in some ways, unconsciously, they're protecting that partner from this dark part of themselves and protecting her from their sexuality. But also, in their desexualization of her and their idealization of her as a mother figure, or as a Madonna, or as a good woman, through her, they seek psychological redemption, right? I have, in quotes, this woman, and therefore I'm good enough. So in both cases, women are used unconsciously as these psychological stepping stones to worth and social currency.
That their relationship somehow elevates them. Yeah, it's interesting you say that. When I was reading a study, Oral Barquette is one of the researchers who was conducting a study on the Madonna Whore Complex. And they did a pretty big sample size of about 107, I think, heterosexual men. It was conducted in Israel, and they did a lot of different psychological testing, like social dominance testing, and just men who scored higher with levels of association with the Madonna Whore Complex. It showed that they had much lower satisfaction in their relationships with women. So it was actually very harmful to men, as well, as they kind of have to feel like they have to uphold these toxic masculinity roles. And they were not able to connect in the way that they wanted to connect with women.
Absolutely. I think so many men don't understand the trap of the Madonna Whore Complex, but they feel it. Because what often happens is, when they do partner up with somebody that they have labeled in their mind, consciously or unconsciously, as a Madonna, that relationship requires them to be dutiful. And after a while, it can feel obligatory in many cases, and even suffocating for them, because they have put their partner in this box. Let's talk a little bit about the impact on women.
Has a huge impact on women, just the rigidity of these two, putting one or the other. You can't be both. You can't be one and the same with someone with the mentality of the Madonna Whore Complex. But it's, gone out, into society, and how that leaks into the workplace, or healthcare, or politics, and religion, and kind of how people view women how women should be treated or respected or not respected. Like you were alluding to earlier, that women with body modifications, putting them in a certain category, and that can translate into the workplace as well. Is this somebody who should be respected or listened to solely based on appearances alone?
I work with so many women who come in and they're devastated because they have spent their whole lives waiting for their partner, waiting for their long-term relationship to begin so they could really dive into exploring their sexuality with that partner, only to find out that their partner can no longer be sexual with them because now they are a wife or a mother. And we do see an increase in desexualization at some of those milestones during engagement, during at a marriage and pregnancy and during childbirth. So it's layered, obviously, right? And each partnership is a little different. Each person is a little different, but it's super tragic because there's so much social conditioning that has shaped people's expectations around sex and their expectations around relationships that they end up 10 years down the line feeling just absolutely devastated and like their relationship is on ice.
How do you treat individuals coming in with the Madonna Whore Complex?
That's a really big question, right? And treatment involves looking at early childhood traumas and early childhood messaging, cultural messaging, societal messaging, and really helping people begin to deconstruct their ideas about sex, their ideas about gender, their ideas about worthiness, and learning how to be more integrated, which can take some time and can be kind of frustrating for folks. But when they go through it, there's incredible liberation from these really rigid paradigms. And I've seen so many couples really struggling with this, and they find themselves, maybe after a little while, a year or so in couples therapy, having incredibly erotic sex and deeper connections. And when they're both willing to peel back these layers, it can be a really powerful gift.
Right. It's a slow process.
Yeah, it's a slow process because these messages, we don't just get like a book when we're born. We don't get a hand guide or a handbook that says, here's how you should think about sex. These messages are given to us through nonverbal messages, looks that our parents give us when there's something sexual on TV, or when the neighbor says a dirty joke or something, right? Like the ways that we're conditioned are so subtle, and they take a long time to start recognizing and questioning for folks who are just getting started in that work.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, you and I are two white women, and I want to make sure that we acknowledge that the experience of the Madonna Whore Complex is different for women of color and for trans women. I'm really curious about your thoughts on how women of other marginalized communities are especially impacted by the Madonna Whore Complex.
Right. Yeah, I think it's important, to acknowledge we are both white, cisgender women. And when researching for this blog, I came across an article written by Rem Bahat, which was amazing. And she focused on how specifically the Madonna Whore Complex impacts women of color and trans women. And so I'll, kind of point to her work and her writing. I thought it was phenomenal. If anyone has the chance to read it, they should. She really goes into how women of color are sexualized, dating back to times of slavery, where white women were seen as kind of like pure and close to Christianity and needing a protection, where women of color were seen as ownership. So a white man approaching a woman of color in an aggressive, hostile, they have to kind of accept these overt sexual messages, and how that's been carried down, to today, how that's still impacting women of color. And same with trans women, of this sexualization in media, especially pornography, that trans women are inherently very sexual and wanting of these sexual interactions. So when a man who has this Madonna Whore Complex sort of approaching a trans woman, if the woman is not interested, it can lead to violence. And that's why we see kind of this high rate of sexual assault in both of these communities.
That's really well said. Thank you for that. It does highlight the extreme fetishization that can come with being a woman of color, being a trans woman. And really, I want to highlight what you said. There is this expectation of ownership or expectation of implicit power over that comes from this hierarchical expectation that many men have, sometimes consciously, many times unconsciously, about who they should be able to have access to and why. And there's such a reductionism in general as it relates to women, of their humanity and an objectification of them. But when we're talking about folks from marginalized groups, almost unequivocally, the aspect of their identity that gives them membership into that marginalized group can become the very aspect of their identity that gets even further exploited. And so it's super important for men who are listening to think about your preferences. I hear that word thrown around a lot. And we are all attracted to what we're attracted to. And also, with examination of some of these different kinds of power structures and our starting point in the world, we can get a lot more clear on what it is actually that is arousing about our so-called preferences, right? And we can develop a more expansive relationship with arousal more often than not.
Yeah, how is it relating to fetish behavior? Especially, I think we discussed too in the past of the fetish of someone's skin color or a body part. How is that, relating to your sexual preferences? How is that impacting your view of women?
Right. And view of women and view of their worthiness and view of their proximity to this white, Christian experience. And the white supremacy, I think, inherent in the Madonna Whore Complex is something that a lot of folks don't want to look at because they really, really have a hard time seeing themselves as participating in any kind of racist or sexist power structure. It's all rooted in white supremacy, and the patriarchy's function is to uphold this gender and racial hierarchy. So I'm not saying this to impose any sort of shame on what folks are attracted to or how they find arousal, but rather to invite them to get more curious about how they are relating to that arousal and how it might be bleeding into their lives outside of sex play with consenting adults. So, Brooke, when you're working with someone in therapy, how do you help them begin moving away from this sort of dichotomous thinking about women?
I think, a lot of what you stated of looking at where these narratives are coming from, I think it's important to note too, if you're someone who's suffering from the Madonna Whore Complex, that in some ways we've all been indoctrinated into this manosphere of, these scripts that are inherited and passed down. And just the step alone, like the acknowledgement that this is a problem, this is not the relationship I want to have with my partner or with other women in my life, is a huge first step. And breaking that down and kind of what led you to this point in your life, what led you to want to make this change, and just looking at where these narratives are coming from. Is it from family members, growing up in a religion, or what aspects of society, and looking at what kind of relationships you would like to have with women or your partner, and what kind of goals can we set in place to help you achieve that.
Yeah, It's really beautiful. It's really beautiful. And I think it gives people the opportunity to also think about their own gender identity and their gender expression, their expectations for what gender means to them and how they are showing up that way. Right. And so many of us grow up with these expectations about our gender being really conditioned into us. And there's not a lot that's biological in terms of difference. There are some biological differences, of course, between, folks of different sexes, but really so much of what we experience are these constructs of gender, and the overcoupling of worthiness, I think, is something that has to be focused on, because we really do overcouple so much of what we are doing in life relevant to how we experience our own gender and our relationships. And that has to be separated from how we see ourselves as worthy individuals walking around on this planet. And when people can start to separate their self-worth from the labels and scripts given to them around gender, then I think they have, not I think, I know, I've worked with many folks who have this absolute like catapult into a different kind of happiness and freedom in their lives. You know what I love saying to men who really are stuck with that narrative? I love to remind them that it was in fact men who came up with monogamy and and wanted monogamy to be the norm. And now they're sort of, saying they're railing against it in many cases. So it's interesting to learn the history of monogamy and the history of heterosexuality, because when we do look at our biology, we are, as you said, so much more similar.
How does the Madonna Whore Complex kind of go into evolutionary psychology?
When you say that, what comes to mind to me immediately is men who like to justify being sexual with younger women because they are healthier and younger and therefore ostensibly better to reproduce with. Is that what you mean?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, I'm not a physician, so I'm not going to speak on the health of pregnancy, although I think there is plenty of data to suggest that women can have healthy babies much later than their teens and young 20s. So we've got to look at the ways in which this idea of vulnerability gets reinforced through the predation of younger women. And many of the men who perpetuate that conversation, whether or not they are being sexual with underage or younger girls, many of them fantasize about it because it does land for them this idea of vulnerable or untouched or virginal. And it supports this idea of a pure person, but none of us are pure or impure, right? We've just either been sexual or we've not been sexual. It's a justification in my mind for them to be able to have access to women who don't challenge them and to women who they can control more effectively because they are either younger, they're not even women yet, they're girls, or they're young women with a certain level of naivete and trust in men who are supposed to be protecting them, but instead are exploiting that vulnerability.
Right. And that, that concept of being pure, of if they are younger, therefore what sexual experiences they have or had not somehow defines them, making them more pure, therefore elevating them out of, their shame or negative feelings about themselves.
Exactly. This fantasy that if they're able to be sexual with a woman who's not been sexual before, somehow that, again, it comes back to this idea of redemption, right? Mm-hmm. I am good because I have access to this other human being who I am labeling as good and worthy. So it's an exploitation and objectification, all in service of men feeling, good enough, worthy enough, powerful enough, and positioned in a culture
that commodifies the experience of women's bodies.
How do you work with women who are sort of suffering from the dichotomy of the Madonna Whore Complex?
Well, it's really similar to the ways in which I work with men. I think first it's a conversation about understanding gender, identity, worth, some education around sex in general, and really helping them challenge the scripts that they've been given about sex and about gender so that they can start to integrate sex and worthiness and being lovable too. I think a lot of women unconsciously put themselves in these camps and they think about, oh, I'm broken because this has happened to me, or I've done this, or I look like this, and therefore I'm not worthy of men's love. I mean, I can't tell you how many women I work with who are absolute badasses. I mean, they're just amazing. They are successful in their chosen work. They are social and kind and generous in the world. They're intelligent. They're creative, and they fear going out into the dating world because so many men shame them for being successful and shame them for living into their fullest potential because it feels threatening to men. So I would say even women who are successful in their careers, if their chosen career is something different than a domestic engineer or a stay-at-home parent, they end up getting lumped into this whore category of women who don't need to be respected or protected. And so I work with women a lot to help them challenge those limiting beliefs, because there are men out there who don't fall into this Madonna Whore Complex
Absolutely.
having group, right? So there are men out there, and then there are men who do have the Madonna Whore Complex in the way that they think about women, but they don't want it, and they want to shift out. And so I help women think about, first of all, how do they value themselves? And how do they cultivate a relationship with their own sexuality that is separate from their worth as women and as humans? I also help them get more discerning about who they're dating and help them develop questions and things that they can think about to evaluate if a partner is going to put them in one of these two camps, or if this ideology is something that might be limiting in a relationship with someone. So I think it's a deconstruction and reconstruction process for people of all genders when they start looking at this in their real lives and how it affects them.
Yeah, absolutely. Another question that kind of came up for me is when someone is currently in a relationship where the man maybe has Madonna Whore Complex, they're not sexually engaging. How do you help women in that scenario?
Ideally, a couple who wants to be together and who are experiencing the effects of Madonna Whore Complex, I would recommend that they go into couples therapy and individual therapy so that they can really get ahead of this and start to create language that allows them to connect more and build different kinds of intimacy. For a lot of men who I work with, I don't like to use the word solution, but a step in the process can often be helping them redefine the way they show up as partners, and also helping them make requests with their partner to redefine how they show up as well. And that sometimes looks like their partner doing less nurturing tasks for them, and sort of stepping out of a maternal role with them. And they can begin to see their partner more as an individual again, and more as somebody who has erotic potential, as opposed to somebody who is taking care of them. And I think that's where there lies a big conflict for a lot of men, because they really value the nurturance and the caregiving that they receive from their female partners. And their female partners often want to provide that, but often feel like it's a tap that doesn't shut off. and a bottomless well. And so helping couples redefine their roles and how they show up together and redistribute domestic labor and become more conscious about their emotional labor and the way they speak with each other and how they cultivate eroticism individually in their own solo sex practice and then bring that to each other can be a really helpful step too.
I like the way you said that. It gives a lot of hope for people in these relationships where maybe this is showing up more than they would like.
I'm so glad you said that because this is a learned paradigm and it can be unlearned. And I really hope that folks listening take that away. It can be unlearned. Question for you. Obviously, we want to be experienced as integrated human beings. But if you had to pick a category to be sent into, would you choose the Madonna or the whore?
Oh, the whore for sure.
Why?
Because I would rather be seen as somebody who is sexually assertive, somebody who's powerful within their own right, who can take care of themselves, because those things are true. And I'd rather be seen in that way of somebody who doesn't need the protection or doesn't need to protect the male ego versus somebody in the Madonna aspect. Now, how have I felt in times in my life I've been placed into one or the other? Absolutely. And it's something that you feel, I think, well, for myself, I felt very early on. And it is painful being placed into either or. It can be very painful and confusing and kind of determining, it can question your own core belief of who you are, and you have to kind of redefine that for yourself.
That's so true. I really appreciate you saying that because it is something that's felt, and it sometimes hits you like a ton of bricks, right? Because all of a sudden you can feel when somebody's perception of you changes, like they've decided you're going to be this to them or you're going to be that to them. And that's something that we don't always have conscious language for, but our body picks it up.
Yeah. I mean, how has it impacted your work of men and how they kind of view you as a professional?
Well, as a psychologist, I think it has impacted me in some interesting ways. So men are often very confused by me because I think they see me and they expect me to be one way. And then I show up and I have brains and a voice and I use them both a lot.
Right.
And I don't say that in like a weird elitist academic way. We all have brains and a voice, but I use mine loudly. So I think that a lot of men get very confused because they don't know where to put me. Because I can also be very nurturing and gentle and kind, and they ascribe those traits to more of a nurturing Madonna role. But I talk about sex a lot. I'm very sexually liberated and empowered, and I have no shame about being a sexual person. So I think that it's very confusing because when people come to work with me, I think that that's really actually something that they find valuable because it gives them access to integration that they might not even understand is there initially, but it can become a part of the fodder of the therapeutic relationship, exploring the transference that comes up with clients around how they've perceived me. And then as they get to work with me, how they come to understand me more as a human being. So I think it can be really fruitful in that way. Dating is a disaster because that's really where I would say a lot of men get so confused, and that confusion makes them angry. They don't know where to put me. They don't know who they want me to be, if they want me to be their mom or their mistress. And so it can be really hard to have some of those conversations, often because a lot of men have never done this kind of work and thought about these constructs in a deeper way. So the fact that I have can even be really threatening and scary for them. So it can sometimes be hard.
Yeah, absolutely. That role, like it kind of goes back to, you were saying the ambivalence of, of you and what role to put you in, and that anger that comes out and directed at you when they can't figure out where they want you to be.
Yeah. It's interesting. I come back to the infuriating and the reassuring reminder that we are all human beings on this path on the planet together, and we learn with each other and from each other. So I really try not to take it personally when someone is evidencing that rigidity, a dichotomous rigidity, because I understand that they just are where they are. If you feel like more of an integrated person, you don't have to continue to spend time with folks who refuse to see you as one. And that sometimes can feel really lonely, because this is such a pervasive dichotomy in our culture. But the more we talk about it collectively, the more we challenge these ideas of good or bad, sexual or nurturing, Madonna or whore, all of those things, when we really challenge them together with kindness and compassion for the growth that's required and the grief that's required to move out of that, that's when I think we really get to build new community that's based on seeing people as whole humans.
Love that. That's beautiful. That the grief that comes with that too, I think, is important. And hopefully through, this work and podcast and your work and my work with modern intimacy, there's more education around, how, like you said, pervasive, and how this impacts, not just the individual, but on a societal level as well.
Yeah, it does. Well, Brooke, I really appreciate you writing the blog about the Madonna Whore Complex and bringing this issue back up into the ether. And for folks listening, you can check out Brooke's blog on the Modern Intimacy website, modernintimacy.com. And we will put some of the articles that Brooke mentioned into the show notes here. So if you're curious about those references and want access to them, check out the website and go to podcasts and find this episode, and then you will see all of them there. All right, Brooke, any last thoughts?
Oh gosh, that was last thoughts. Just, take care of yourself, be mindful of the way you think about women. I think that that's so important. Even if you're not expressing it, just the thoughts that you have about women, and for women to continue to be, sexually expressive and feeling like they can be as big as they want in their space.
Love that. I love that. All right. Thank you, everyone, for tuning into this episode of the Modern Intimacy Podcast. We'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Modern Intimacy Podcast. On Instagram, follow me at Dr. Kate Balestrieri and at The Modern Intimacy. On TikTok, check me out at Dr. Kate Balestrieri, and on Twitter at Kate Balestrieri. Everyone has questions about mental health, sex, and relationships. Send yours to me via DM on Instagram, or email them to questions@modernintimacy.com, and I'll answer some at the end of each episode. Visit the website, modernintimacy.com, to schedule a consultation with a member of our team or to sign up for our newsletter. Let's meet back here next week. New episodes air every Tuesday. Reminder, this podcast is for education and entertainment purposes only and is not a substitute for mental health services.